Soviet Russia and the Negro. An essay by Claude McKay. I met the spirit of sympathetic appreciation and response prevailing in all circles in Moscow and Petrograd. I never guessed what was awaiting me in Russia. I had left America in September of 1922, determined to get there, to see into the new revolutionary life of the people and report on it. I was not a little dismayed when, congenitally averse to notoriety as I am, I found that, on stepping upon Russian soil, I forthwith became a notorious character. And strangely enough, there was nothing unpleasant about my being swept into the surge of revolutionary Russia. For better or for worse, every person in Russia is vitally affected by the revolution. No one but a soulless body can live there without being stirred to the depths by it. I reached Russia in November, the month of the 4th Congress of the Communist International, and the 5th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. The whole revolutionary nation was mobilized to honor the occasion. Petrograd was magnificent in red flags and streamers. Red flags fluttered against the snow from all the great granite buildings. Railroad trains, streetcars, factories, stores, hotels, schools, all wore decorations. It was a festive month of celebration in which I, as a member of the Negro race, was a very active participant. I was received as though the people had been apprised of and were prepared for my coming. When Max Eastman and I tried to bore our way through the dense crowds that jammed the streets of Moscow on the 7th of November, I was caught, tossed up into the air, and passed along by dozens of stalwart youths. "How warmly excited they get over a strange face," said Eastman. A young Russian communist remarked, "But where is the difference? Some of the Indians are as dark as you." To which another replied, "The lines of the face are different. The Indians have been with us long." And so people instinctively see the difference. And so always the conversation revolved around me until my face flamed. The Moscow press printed long articles about the Negroes in America. A poet was inspired to rhyme about the Africans looking to socialist Russia, and soon I was in demand everywhere. At the lectures of poets and journalists, the meetings of soldiers and factory workers, slowly I began losing self-consciousness with the realization that I was welcomed thus as a symbol, as a member of the great American Negro group, kin to the unhappy black slaves of European imperialism in Africa, that the workers in Soviet Russia, rejoicing in their freedom, were greeting through me. Russia, in broad terms, is a country where all the races of Europe and of Asia meet and mix. The fact is that, under the repressive power of the Tsarist bureaucracy, the different races preserved a degree of kindly tolerance toward each other. The fierce racial hatreds that time in the Balkans never existed in Russia, where in the South no Negro might approach a cracker as a man for friendly offices. A Jewish pilgrim in old Russia could find rest and sustenance in the home of an Orthodox peasant. It is a problem to define the Russian type by features. The Hindu, the Mongolian, the Persian, the Arab, the West European, all these types may be traced, woven into the distinctive polyglot population of Moscow. And so the Russian, I was merely another type, but stranger, with which they were not yet familiar. They were curious with me, all and sundry, young and old, in a friendly, refreshing manner. Their curiosity had none of the intolerable impertinence, and often downright affront, that any very dark-colored man, be he Negro, Indian, or Arab, would experience in Germany and England. In 1920, while I was trying to get out a volume of poems in London, I had a visit with Bernard Shaw, who remarked that it must be tragic for a sensitive Negro to be an artist. Shaw was right. Some of the English reviews of my book touched the very bottom of journalistic muck. The English reviewer outdid his American cousin, except the South, of course, which cannot surprise any white person, much less black, in sprinkling criticism with racial prejudice. The sedate, copperhead spectator as much said no cultured white man could read a Negro's poetry without prejudice, that instinctively he must search for that something that must make him antagonistic to it. But fortunately, Mr. McKay did not offend their susceptibilities. The English people, from the lowest to the highest, cannot think of a black man as being anything but an entertainer, boxer, a Baptist preacher, or a menial. The Germans are just a little worse. Any healthy-looking black coon of an adventurous streak can have a wonderful time palming himself off as another Sikh or buck dancer. When an American writer introduced me as a poet to a very cultured German, a lover of all of the arts, he could not believe it, and I don't think he does yet. An American student tells his middle-class landlady that he is having a black friend to lunch. "But are you sure that he is not a cannibal?" she asks, without a flicker of a humorous smile. But in Petrograd and Moscow, I cannot detect a trace of this ignorant snobbishness among the educated classes, and the attitude of the common workers, the soldiers and the sailors, was still more remarkable. It was so beautifully naive. For them, I was only a member of the world of humanity. It may be urged that the fine feelings of the Russians towards the Negro was the effect of the Bolshevist pressure and propaganda. The fact is that I spent most of my leisure time in nonpartisan and anti-Bolshevist circles. In Moscow, I found the Lux Hotel, where I put up extremely depressing. The dining room was anathema to me, and I grew tired to death of meeting the proletarian ambassadors from foreign lands, some of whom bore themselves as if they were the holy messengers of Jesus, Prince of Heaven, instead of working-class representatives. And so I spent many of my free evenings at the Domino Cafe, a notorious den of the dilettante poets and writers. There came the young anarchists and Menshevists, and all the young aspirant fry, to read and discuss their poetry and prose. Sometimes a group of the older men came too. One evening, I noticed Pelino, the novelist, Okanoff, the critic, Fyodor, the translator of Poe, an editor, a theater manager, and the young disciples, beer drinking through a very interesting literary discussion. There was always music, good folk singing, and bad fiddling. The place was more like a second-rate cabaret than a poets' club, but nevertheless much less to be enjoyed, with amiable chats and light banter, through which the evening wore away pleasantly. This was the meeting place of the frivolous set with whom I eased my mind after writing all day. The evenings of the proletarian poets, held in the Arbit, were much more serious affairs. The leadership was communist, the audience working class, and attentive like diligent elementary school children. To these meetings also came some of the keener intellects from the Domino Cafe. One of these young women told me that she wanted to keep in touch with all the phases of the new culture. In Petrograd, the meetings of the intelligentsia seemed more formal and inclusive. There were such notable men there as Tchaikovsky the critic, Eugene Zamyatin the celebrated novelist, and Maishak, the poet and translator of Kipling. The artists and theater world were also represented. There was no communist spirit in evidence at these intelligentsia gatherings. Frankly, there was an undercurrent of hostility to the Bolshevists. But I was invited to speak and read my poems wherever I appeared, at any of them, and treated with every courtesy and consideration as a writer. Among those sophisticated and cultured Russians, many of them speaking from 2 to 4 languages, there was no overdoing of the correct thing, no vulgar wonderment and boundarish superiority over a Negro's being as a poet. I was a poet, that was all, and their keen questions showed that they were much more interested in the technique of my poetry, my views on, and my position regarding the modern literature movements than in the difference of my color.